I'm 26 and I turned 22 in a spinal rehabilitation ward, diagnosed a paraplegic as a sole survivor of a plane crash. By 22 years old, I'd experienced the highest of the highs, pursuing something that had never ever been done before, a normal Aussie kid out to break a world record. I'd met the Royals, received all these different awards, published a book. I was living a life of highs. Did that adventure around the world bring with it adversity and challenges? Absolutely, any expedition does. But they were different challenges to that of a paraplegic diagnosis and unrequested adversity.
Welcome to the Meaningful Work Podcast, your source for ideas, inspiration, and tools for unleashing your best, most fulfilling work yet. Now, your host, Josh Schneider.
Oh, welcome into the show today. Excited to be here with you for this one. Our guest today is Ryan Campbell. Now, Ryan has lived a life of adventure and adversity. At the age of 19, after 2 years of planning, fundraising $250,000 and renting a small airplane, this Aussie teenager set off on a solo flight around the world. That wild journey was a success, documented in the book Born to Fly. Now, the life of highs soon changed following a terrible plane crash, leaving Ryan diagnosed a paraplegic. What followed was a long journey, not only back to his feet, but back into the sky. Welcome to the show today, Ryan Campbell, keynote speaker.
Thanks for having me, Josh. I appreciate it.
So, got a couple questions. Well, after reading that, I've got a lot more questions. But what I want to know is, one of the big premises is, how do we get breakthrough? And so obviously you've had many, many different levels and elements of breakthrough. So I'm interested in, where did the idea come from to even fly around the world?
My mom would ask you the same question, to be honest. But I think at heart, as a young guy, I always wanted more. I wasn't a content kid. It took a lot to keep me happy on a day-to-day basis. I had wanted to be a pilot since I was very, very young. But it took a newspaper article at age 14, reading about another young kid who flew an airplane on his own the day that he turned 15, to really kick me into gear. I was jealous. I was envious. I read the article over and over again. I looked at what he did, and I thought, if he could do that, why can't I? So off I went on this journey of learning to fly an airplane. And I set a goal, and that goal was to fly solo also on my 15th birthday, the day that you could legally do so. And much to my mum's dismay, I took off in an aeroplane on my 15th birthday and flew it completely on my own, thus becoming a pilot. So that achieving something the day that I could at the youngest possible age started this crazy, crazy adventure of wanting to achieve everything I could at the youngest possible age. And eventually that led to the idea of wanting to fly around the world.
Wow. I remember being 16 and a half, getting into a car, but interesting. So talk to me about the transition from that incredible moment, or the feeling of accomplishing that, and then the low that eventually came about when you had this crash, when you had this massive change.
Absolutely. For me, I've lived a life of adventure and adversity. I'm 26. I walk like I'm 75. My mind is that of an 85-year-old man, but I'm 26. And I turned 22 in a spinal rehabilitation ward, diagnosed a paraplegic as a sole survivor of a plane crash. By 22 years old, I'd experienced the highest of the highs, pursuing something that had never ever been done before, a normal Aussie kid out to break a world record. I'd met the Royals, received all these different awards, published a book. I was living a life of highs. Did that adventure around the world bring with it adversity and challenges? Absolutely, any expedition does. But they were different challenges to that of a paraplegic diagnosis and unrequested adversity. So this life of highs and lows developed in a way where I now speak on navigating change. And one of my favorite things to talk about is, where do you learn your life lessons from? You know, we have all these amazing people who've gone out and climbed a mountain, and they've gone out and sailed solo around the world, or they've achieved things in the world of adventure, requested adventure, that are absolutely mind-boggling. And I look up to so many people who've done things like that. But we also have the people out there who've experienced unrequested adversity, harsh, life is a struggle moments of pain and suffering. For me, experiencing both those things made me realize that my life takeaways, the very lessons that made me who I am today, did not come from the highs, they came from the lows.
And obviously, when you're laid up in this bed with life literally going 180 degrees in a different direction than it was the day before, what were some of the things that maybe at the time you didn't realize, but what were some of those mindsets or stories that you started to tell yourself during that season that helped you go from laying flat on your back to now, like you said, might look like a 75-year-old walk, but I mean, truly. And so clearly life sometimes finds us in those difficult situations. So I'm interested in, what were some of those mindsets or stories that you told yourself?
I had there are so many. I'll preface with saying that one of the first real moments or turning points for me was I was struggling. And not only was I struggling, but I had a lot of people watching me, knowing that I was struggling. I'd just been through a terrible accident. I was the pilot in command. We'd suffered an engine failure just after takeoff in a vintage biplane manufactured in the 1930s. I had done all I could as a pilot, and yet that hadn't been enough. 3 seconds after the engine failure on takeoff, what had resulted was a massive accident. I was dealing with loss. I was dealing with identity theft in a way. I was known for flying. I was the kid who flew around the world, and now I was the kid laid up in a hospital bed, suffering the way that I was. A lot of people were worried about me. The first turning point, I remember in my wheelchair, you know, I had no movement or feeling from the waist down. I had 5 breaks in my back, a shattered face, a shattered leg. I was beaten and bruised from head to toe. And I remember wheeling in my wheelchair out to the cafeteria in the hospital and meeting my mum there for a coffee. And I said to Mum, I've realized what's going to get me through this. And her eyes lit up. And it was one of those mum moments where she thought that this was good news. And it was, but it wasn't the news she expected. My response was, Mum, I have to toughen the hell up. That was a turning point for me to realize that this wasn't a positive situation. This wasn't something that was just going to go away. And I could cry in my soup all I wanted, but that was not going to fix this. And I had to toughen up. I had to sink or swim. And I was choosing to swim. And from that day on, I did just that. I worked as hard as I could in rehabilitation. I took all the advice that I could. I put a focus on my mental health as well as my physical health, and started to pull together what I called the mindset toolbox, a whole bunch of little life lessons I was learning along the way that I could use when the moments were hard. Gosh, honestly, Josh, there are so many. But
so if I want to drill in on one, and when you were talking about the loss of identity, so for you it was clear, it was black and white, but for many of us in the workplace, we have an identity in being smart and getting something quickly, or succeeding, or performing, or being happy. We build our identity without thinking. We're not piecing our identity together, but it is forming as our life experience comes together. And so for you, that was ripped away very clearly. For many of us, it's something that all of a sudden the fabric of who we are gets pulled at, as maybe we're in a role that we're underperforming, or we're challenged, or we're struggling, or even change is thrust upon us. So in the context of your identity, and I would even maybe imagine that being a human being, that is still forming and piecing together. But can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's when you said that, there was a part of me that just leapt up, and man, I want to know more.
Absolutely. And I think when you say change is thrust upon us, this is my passion now. What I speak about on the speaking circuit is change. What I write about in blogs and articles is change, because that is what I experienced. And change actually became the catalyst for growth for me. Yes, I had an identity crisis following the accident, because the round the world kid who wrote a book called Born to Fly, ironically, was now a paraplegic plane crash survivor. So yes, my identity was compromised in that moment. But by not giving up and powering forward, what I created was a new and improved identity. Without that change, I couldn't have learnt what I did to put myself in a position where I'm now known for not only flying around the world, becoming a paraplegic plane crash survivor, learning to walk and fly again, but being the guy who understands the process in using adversity in our lives to fuel that next journey to success. I couldn't have had that without that change of identity. So yes, the identity was torn away from me. And yes, that was hard. But every listener needs to understand that an identity change is okay. An identity change is a good thing, provided you are in control of that, provided you have clear and concise goals moving forward and you know where you want to be. Embrace that identity change, because it is forming you, in most cases, when you have control, into a bigger and better human, prepared and equipped to do more good than what you could have done in a previous life.
And I think that there's so many things that we walk through in life that on the front end, we would never have asked for them, would never want to experience this pain or this circumstance. But with the mindset and some of the tools that you're talking about, we're able to take, and I am not a believer of like, well, I'm just dealt this hand of cards, and this is what I'm stuck with. And that's BS. No, you push the hand back in and you say, give me another hand. And that might take months, or sometimes it might take years, might take decades. However, I love, you said I was compromised in the moment, but it made me stronger in the long run. And I think, speak to that just a little bit more about that journey, because I think when we've crossed through something, it's easy for us on the back end to be like, oh, I made it. But in the moment, one of my favorite quotes is Winston Churchill. And he said, when you feel like you're going through hell, keep going. And I think like he found that like life will oftentimes not resist you towards the direction. And I think like even, practical to the concept of this podcast and meaningful work is not always this path with no resistance and no friction. It's oftentimes the friction and the resistance along the way that helps us become the individual or step into that role that creates that meaningful work.
100%. Look, what you're talking about in the way of resistance, that is the adversity side of my story. And the adversity side of my story is what made me grow. When I was in hospital as that round the world kid who'd, been throughout the Australian and international media, people knew about the fact I was in hospital. And I had wonderful people come by the ward and spend time with me. I had so many people such as that come in and help. The most important lesson that relates not only to my recovery, but what you're talking about, was the last day that I was in hospital. I jumped into my wheelchair and I wheeled down to a cafe right outside the hospital. And I met with a guy who I'd seen on social media, but never met in person. His name was Paul DeGelder. He's now based in Los Angeles. He was a Navy clearance diver for the Australian Navy. And one day, whilst diving in Sydney Harbour, he was attacked by a shark and he lost his arm and his leg. Now, not only was he attacked by a shark and lost his arm and leg, but he went on to be one of the fittest, most phenomenal, bionic-looking men I've ever met in my life. And, that sounds a little bit weird, but look, phenomenal guy. Paul walked down the street. He sat down with me. So I'm in a wheelchair. He's got one arm and one leg. We'd look like we'd had a really rough Friday night out on the town. And he talked to me about what I was going through. And in 3 words, he changed my life. And I've already said it once in this podcast to prove that it's sink or swim. He did not have to explain those words. He did not have to do anything. I could look at Paul and understand that he had been through his own version of adversity and he had succeeded to overcome that and use that as a good to benefit others, to inspire others. I knew he had chosen to swim. Now, if we want to look at sinking, and I'm a very blunt Australian guy, sinking is suicide. Now, I know that's a very touchy topic for a lot of people, but sinking is a very long journey to that point. That is the end of that journey. And it doesn't matter where you're at. If you decide to sink, you are somewhere on that scale of bad. It's negativity, you are struggling, it's depression, it's all of that side of things. However, the swim path is the one that I took, and that is just to swim, swim, swim. No matter how bad the day is, find another way to get up the next morning and give it your all. Now, all the days aren't going to be phenomenal, but it's that journey to swimming that puts you in a position that allows you to then help and inspire others in the same way Paul did. So, look, I think that the journey of resistance that you talk about, you know, in your work life, in your professional life, in your home life, that journey of resistance is a good thing. Once you learn to use that adversity and struggle in your day-to-day life to better yourself and fuel the next day's journey, honestly, you become as close to unstoppable as I think you physically can.
Wow. So when it comes to sink or swim, sinking it's real. It's very real. They're real emotions, real feelings. And so I want to point this towards how did you swim? Because I think it may be challenges that are so black and white, like Paul lost 2 limbs. And I think to some people, it's like, well, there is only one choice, and that is how do you move forward from that? But in work, if you're feeling stuck, if your performance is slipping, if all of a sudden you're feeling like I'm not feeling this like I once was, it's not as black and white. And so there is that middle ground sometimes between sink or swim, and that's just stay alive. That's tread water. But when it comes to swimming, when it comes to moving forward, and truly finding, obviously from your story, and if you could contextualize it maybe a little bit around work, how does somebody in work truly move forward with that idea of, okay, I'm not sinking. I realize these feelings are real, but how do I truly swim? And maybe in some ways swim in the right direction.
100%. And before I jump into that, make sure that everyone understands that treading water is swimming. You don't go to the school swimming carnival and see the kid treading water and go, he's sinking, he's drowning, rescue him. No, you don't. You're not underwater. You're keeping your head above water. And kudos to you for doing that. Don't put the onus on yourself that you must always be moving forward. Treading water is okay, because that's when we have time to reevaluate, to lay some goals ahead of us, to really look at, okay, what's the situation and how am I going to get that movement back? So really, really embrace the treading water. I think that's very important. I am a pilot at heart. No matter what I do for the rest of my life, I'll always be a pilot at heart. Now, when we're flying an aeroplane along and something goes wrong, if there's a fire in the cockpit, if the GPS turns off unexpectedly, the electrical system fails, if a passenger falls ill, we have a checklist. Not only do we have a checklist for normal operations, we have a checklist for abnormal operations. When something goes wrong and the red light flashes in an aeroplane, we don't just start pushing buttons and pulling levers. It's not a pray and push approach. We pull out a checklist. So my advice is to people out there who are living their day-to-day lives, are trying to achieve great things, they're trying to swim, is to have a checklist approach in your life, especially in the abnormal moments. My success in spinal ward, as you could say, as much as you can be successful in spinal ward, was a 3-step checklist to navigating change. That's what that was. My identity, for all these different reasons, physically and mentally, I had undergone change and I had to work my way through that. So a 3-step checklist was how I tackled it. The first one is gratitude. The second one is confidence. And the third one is resilience. So this is my tip and my advice to your listeners in their day-to-day work. How do you navigate change and adversity in your day-to-day life? 3-step checklist: gratitude, confidence, resilience. The first one, find thankfulness in your situation. Just stop. Honestly, now that you've said it, tread water for a little while. Just sit there for a moment. I found thankfulness in being a paraplegic. I was lucky to be a paraplegic, and here's why. Because the first day they put me in a rehabilitation gym, they laid me out on a bed and they said, today's lesson is to roll over. And I felt like a fish out of water. I'm making all of these jokes. Everyone's watching me. I'm trying to roll over, work out how I'm going to get these big chunky legs to kind of flip over, and they don't move and I can't feel them. And it was just all of a mess. I had honestly extreme pain. So I stopped. And I looked through a little hole in my arm and I saw a quadriplegic sitting in his chair staring at me. His name was Ben. He was in his early 30s. He'd fallen over mopping his girlfriend's floor and hit his head. He had no movement from his chest down, barely any movement in his arms, no movement in his hands. And that was the way he was going to be for the rest of his life. And I realized in that moment that Ben would have given anything just for one chance to roll over. And you know what that did? It gave me perspective. And it didn't just give me perspective. He smacked me over the head with perspective in that moment. I was so lucky to have what I had physically. And that helped me mentally. I found gratitude and thankfulness in my situation. That changed my entire mindset to how I was going to tackle the challenge at hand. So if you find yourself in a challenge at work, or you find yourself in a challenge at home, find thankfulness. That is the first step in your checklist. As if you're a pilot, you'll understand you can't jump onto checklist item number 2 until the first one's done. So find thankfulness. The second one is confidence. So you're thankful for the situation. You're ready to tackle it thanks to gratitude, but you got to find confidence. How do we find confidence? Lock in the next step of what you are going to do. So we all have journeys and we all have goals. We all have an end goal that we look at and a place we'd love to be, right? Whatever that is. For me, it was walking and flying again, right? But I didn't know how that journey was going to play out. What was important to me and what truly mattered to me is I knew the next step. Now, all you need is the courage and commitment for any challenge, right? Courage to take it on, commitment to see it through. If you lock in the next step, you've got something to focus on. You've got no excuses. You've got something to execute. Now, learning to walk, funnily enough, is just one step at a time. So locking in the next step was very important in learning to walk. But after you find your thankfulness in a situation, find your confidence in the next step, lock in your next step, and get to work. The last one's resilience. It's only a 3-step checklist. The last step is resilience. Now, to me, this is the most important thing, because we talk about sinking and swimming. We're talking about an adventure and adversity, and we talk about these moments of struggles that transform us into who we really are, right? To have resilience is key. How do we do it? We anticipate the need to adapt. I don't care what your challenge is. The journey from where you are to the solution, to the end goal, will have moments where you have to adapt. You have to jump left, you have to jump right, you have to work through little unexpected moments of extra adversity. So if you anticipate the need to adapt, be ready. Understand that the road will have challenges. Understand that you will have to work around things as time goes on. What will happen is when those struggles arrive in the moment, you won't be shocked. The shock factor is taken away. You will merely start to attack that little problem like you have the overall problem. You'll work through your little checklist. You'll find thankfulness. You'll find confidence. You'll lock in the next step of how to get around that. And before you know it, you'll be back on course working towards that end goal. Find gratitude, find confidence, find resilience.
Wow. Honestly, I was taking notes there. And I love how simple it was. Locking in the next step. It's not saying you have to know every single step ahead. Confidence does not come from knowing the entire path. Confidence comes from just locking in that next step. The resilience, the anticipate, the need to adapt. As you were saying that, like, but Ryan, how do I know everything that's coming? And you're saying you don't have to know everything that's coming. You don't have to know how to handle everything that's coming. But by anticipating this, I am removing the shock factor. And then gratitude. I mean, there's so much neuroscience that supports that. But even from when you were talking, I was pulling out that even Ben in that story, Ben was able to inspire somebody in his situation. And I think sometimes even being grateful for where we're at, one of the things we always pray and have our kids pray is we're thankful for what we have and we're thankful for what we're about to receive. And so, Ryan, I genuinely thank you so much for taking the time to come and share some insights and I think some, not only some mindsets, but I think this checklist is powerful, and it's powerful because it's simple and I can remember it. So thank you so much, Ryan. Tell everybody where they can reach out with you, how they can best connect with you and continue to follow you and watch you on your journey.
No, Josh, you're more than welcome. Thanks so much for having me. They can jump on ryancampbell.co. That's .co. I can't yet afford the M. So ryancampbell.co. We have weekly blogs and all sorts of goodies on there. But otherwise, connect with me on LinkedIn at Ryan Campbell Speaking, or jump over onto Instagram at ryan.campbell13. But we'd love to connect. If you have any questions, if you want to chat more, just reach out, jump on the website, send us a message. We are ready to chat.